Alrighty, welcome everyone to another exciting edition of American Studies 395. One of the big themes in this class, one of the insights that we come back to time and time again, both in lectures and in the readings, is this question of who is a Californian. As we've already seen in previous lectures, the question of who is a Californian, who is one of us, has been very contentious in California history. We have seen the ways in which people who are often welcomed in as immigrants are also subject to race riots and exclusionary efforts. The first book we read in this class, Gustavo Arellano's book, is not just a history of Orange County or an autobiography. It's really about Californian, Arellano himself, coming to terms with his place within California and his political consciousness, by which he stands up and says, I too am a Californian, I too am an heir to the California dream, and I am going to demand to be recognized as a full and equal member of the California community and one who deserves a shot at the California dream. I am such a Californian that I am going to explain Orange County to you. That's really the theme of that book. So already in the reading, certainly in some of the previous lectures that we've had, we've seen this argument in California history in the 20th century regarding who is a Californian. That question means more than just being here, being within the boundaries of California, being a contributory member to the California economy and society. Despite that, you can still be excluded, as some seek to deny your place within California. So hopefully at this point in the class, you've come to see this question of who is a Californian as a complicated one, as a field of contest and debate, and one that, with that contest and debate now increasingly visible to us in the readings and the lectures, as an ongoing theme overall in the class that also prefigures where we're going in many of the lectures and readings we have later in the course. Here today we're going to talk about that question of who is a Californian in the context of World War II. And we'll talk about how, though this was a conflict couched in the language of freedom, fighting for democracy, in World War II the United States liked to imagine itself as this beacon of freedom and democracy. We were often told during World War II that we were fighting against the greatest racist in human history, Adolf Hitler. And yet, our own lack of freedom and democracy, our own racism, was baldly on display, as you can see here in California when we turn our attention to this contentious issue of who is a Californian in regards to race and World War II. The United States enters World War II after the attack in Hawaii on Pearl Harbor. And when the attack on Pearl Harbor took place, it was widely thought that it wasn't an isolated incident, that instead it would be the first of many attacks to come. We now know, based on hindsight, there will be no further attacks on American soil after Pearl Harbor, but that's an insight that comes with looking backward from 2019. In 1941, early 42, there was a growing consensus in the United States that what happened at Pearl Harbor is just the first of many attacks to come, and as part of that consensus, there was an agreement that likely the next point of attack, the next place the Japanese will bomb, would be here in California, because of course it's the next place proximal to Japan, the West Coast. Japan was likely to attack the West Coast rather than the East Coast, and with it comes a fear that if Japan attacks California, as many assumed it would in a period where there was a widespread consensus that the attacks at Pearl Harbor are just one of many to come, that people of Japanese descent here, people here within California, will side with the Japanese because they're not real Americans. They're not loyal to America. That somewhere deep inside them, they harbor loyalties to Japan. And so, in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, all people of Japanese descent in the United States, most of whom are here in California or Hawaii, because of trends we talked about in earlier lectures where Japanese immigrants had come after the Chinese Exclusion Act and established themselves in Hawaii and also here in California, there was a sense that those immigrants and the children of immigrants, American citizens, Japanese Americans who have never been to Japan, that they are potentially disloyal, that they're secretly loyal to Japan, that they can't be trusted, that they are a danger within. Now, this doesn't just come from Pearl Harbor and the hysteria and fears that followed it. As again we documented in a previous lecture, there was already an extant, already existing anti-Japanese bias far before World War II. And it led to things like the Gentleman's Agreement when we banned immigration from Japan. It led to things like the Alien Land Law, where there was an effort in progressive era California to deny land ownership to Asian and Asian Americans. So we've already documented how well before Pearl Harbor there's an extant existing racial bias against the Japanese in particular, and broadly against all Asians and Asian Americans, American citizens who were born here. So the hysteria that followed Pearl Harbor was built on that already existing foundation. It was built on an already existing trend of exclusionary attitudes and laws and practices that denied equality to people of Japanese descent, that said you might be here, you might be part of the California community and economy, but you're not one of us. So it's important to note that internment, the World War II policy that saw Japanese and Japanese Americans rounded up and held in internment camps, was built on an already existing, as we've documented earlier, racial bias and exclusionary message. Here's a scene from a Los Angeles neighborhood in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor when the internment order was being enforced. Here is a lovely lady who has decorated her home in this way, saying that people of Japanese descent, here using a pejorative, using a racial slur, are not part of this neighborhood, this community, and therefore this California. In February of 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt issues Executive Order 9066 that ordered the expulsion of people of Japanese descent away from the West Coast. The logic, if you can call it that, of internment was that the Japanese are likely to attack. They're likely to attack California on its coast, and that Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans, again, people who are born here, American citizens, and the majority, 2/3 of those subject to internment were American citizens, ostensibly protected under the Constitution, and just as American as Franklin Roosevelt himself, there was this belief that they will join with the Japanese and help in this invasion. And so we got to pull them away from the West Coast and concentrate them in internment camps located either in the interior of California. In a moment, I'll take a look at a map that will show you exactly where the camps were, demonstrating that there's this effort to draw them away from the coast so they could not aid the enemy. Or in some instances far away from California, as many who were subject to internment were kept on military bases and internment camps well into the interior of the United States. Executive Order 9066 that enforced internment applied to people with as little as 1/16 Japanese blood. So we're not talking about people who came directly from Japan the year before the Gentleman's Agreement or people who snuck in afterwards. It applied to American citizens, people who were born here, the children of immigrants. The 14th Amendment, as we talked about earlier in the class, stipulates that all people born within the United States are citizens. It applied, though, to those citizens, the children of immigrants, because they are of Japanese descent, and it applied to people with as little Japanese blood as 1/16. So it wasn't motivated by a very real, rational concern about infiltration. It again was rooted in the hysteria that followed Pearl Harbor and an anti-Japanese racist bias that predated Pearl Harbor. In a moment, we'll take a look again at a map showing the camps. They were located in the interior of California or throughout the mountain interior region of the continental United States, all again based on some sort of idea, logic, conception that you can't have Japanese Americans along the West Coast because if Japan invades, they'll throw down their rakes, their pencils as students, whatever they're doing in their lives, and join with the Japanese army. So Executive Order 9066 is issued amidst this fear, hysteria, pressure on Roosevelt to protect America from what was imagined to be another Pearl Harbor. And people of Japanese descent are ordered to mobilize, gather at relocation centers, and then ultimately to be housed in internment camps scattered throughout California and throughout the nation. 118,000 people were subject to Executive Order 9066, two-thirds of whom were American citizens, born here, no direct connection to Japan, patriots, Americans, many of whom will go on to serve in World War II, many of whom will fight and die for a nation that treated them in this fashion. They should have been protected by the Constitution, its Bill of Rights, that would have prohibited such arbitrary incarceration. But in the hysteria after Pearl Harbor, in the sentiments you saw in the previous photograph of that woman and her sign, with the existing anti-Japanese bias, their rights as citizens didn't mean a damn thing. 90% of those who were subject to executive order were Californians. So internment is a California story. Most of the camps were here in California. 90% of those who were subject to internment were Californians. So this is really a provocative and important moment to think about this question of who is a Californian, one of the big macro themes of the class. Does being a Californian mean you're here, you're a citizen of the state and nation, you are a contributor to the California economy and society? Is that what defines being a Californian? Well, in this instance, it did not, because despite that, these Californians were told emphatically, you're not one of us. In fact, you're likely loyal to the enemy, and now we're going to deprive you of those rights. So, internment. As I mentioned, here's a look at the camps and where they were located. Some very local points of reference here. There was a relocation center, assembly center, at the Santa Anita racetrack. So very close to us here in Southern California. Pomona, very close to Cal State Fullerton, was another assembly center where people of Japanese descent were told, go there and await ultimately your fate, when they would later be sent to the internment camps where they were housed. So the camp at Pomona and in Santa Anita, two very local areas here, were assembly centers, and then later those who were housed there would be sent to more permanent camps in places like Manzanar, which is probably the most famous of the camps. And it's famous because a number of books have been written, memoirs. If you've read Farewell to Manzanar, it's a classic of Asian American literature, American literature. And also Manzanar is very famous because it's been restored and kept as a museum. And you can head out there, and it's just really rich in a variety of artifacts that document what the camps were like. Tule Lake, another large camp in Northern California. And then, as you can also see, there were camps in the interior of the United States beyond California, and they tended to house the people who were deemed the most likely to be sympathetic to the Japanese. One of the things that internment did was it put you in this impossible situation as subject to it. Because you were held in the camps, and men, Japanese American men who were subject to internment, were asked two questions upon their arrival in the camps. One, are you loyal to the United States? And two, are you willing to serve in the army, in the military, against the Japanese? And it's absurd, of course. It's an impossible conundrum, because the entire premise of internment was that you're not loyal, that we can't trust you, that we have to deprive you of your rights. And then you're asked, are you loyal? And then the second question was, are you willing to fight and die potentially for a nation that has treated you in this way? And remarkably, revealingly, tens of thousands of Japanese American men who were subject to internment said yes and fought. And many of them died in the Pacific against the Japanese, even though that wasn't evidence for the fraud of internment and the real true bravery and loyalty of the Japanese in the minds of the American officials who enforced it. It wasn't as if when a bunch of Japanese Americans volunteer to fight, they say, well, I guess you are loyal, and they release everyone. So there's so many absurdities to it. Those who said no and no were known as no-no boys, and another famous memoir regarding internment is titled No-No Boy. And that was an impossible conundrum because you can see why someone would say, no, I'm not loyal to a country that's treated me in this way. No, I'm not going to fight for a nation that treats me like cattle. There's a way in which it seems you'd be very sympathetic to anyone who protested, who said no. But if you did that, well, you're only seemingly reinforcing the logic rationale of internment. See, these people aren't loyal. So whether you said yes, yes, or no, no, you are in this impossible situation. Here's another image from downtown LA after Executive Order 90666 was announced, where Japanese Americans like the grocer here who own a business, who employed Californians in Los Angeles, receives this notice and he's told, you got to go to Santa Anita or you got to go to Pomona. Your fate is completely unclear. It's also something to be mindful of as we go forward in this lecture. We have hindsight. We can look back and say, well, eventually they released people in 1945. Well, in 1942, they don't have that hindsight. They're being told to pack up and give up potentially their lives, their belongings, and there's no indication as to whether or not you'll ever be released again. And so this grocer here in downtown LA, captured in this photograph, protested internment simply by making this clear, emphatic statement about identity. I am an American. I was born here too. I'm a taxpayer. I'm a contributory member of the California society, the American society. And yet you treat me as disloyal. So it's really about identity, who is a Californian, who is an American. Tellingly, internment ended well before the war ended. It's another way of demonstrating the fraud of internment. This wasn't about protecting America. This wasn't about a true threat. Because we released people even before the war was over. So if this was about protecting America, if this was about ensuring that the Japanese could not help Japanese Americans help in an attack, well, why did we release them when the war was still going on? In January of 1945, Executive Order 90666 is rescinded, and those who were held captive in these concentration camps, internment camps, were released and given $25 and a train ticket home for the loss of 3 years of their lives, for being branded by their own government as disloyal, potential traitors. They received $25 and a train ticket home. And for most of them, that's all the recompense that they would ever receive. In the 1980s, there was an effort to offer and eventually extend reparations to those who were subject to internment. And they received cash payments from the U.S. government that finally conceded that this was wrong, a terrible pall on our history. But you had to live until the 1980s to receive that money. And that's why the majority of people who were released in 1945, who will not live until the 1980s, 40 years later, never received any compensation other than $25 and a train ticket home. When they finally made their way back to their homes, their farms, their businesses, they saw that their homes and farms and businesses had been ransacked, destroyed. Oftentimes they had lost their homes and businesses because while subject to internment, they were unable to pay mortgages or property taxes, and their property was seized. So not only did they lose 3 years of their life, not only did they experience this questioning of their loyalty, but they lost the family wealth, or their homes were destroyed. This was a great boon to some. As I mentioned earlier when we talked about Filipino migration to California, Japanese were very skilled and successful farmers when they came to California. That's part of why there was a backlash against them, leading to the Gentleman's Agreement. And so white farmers who weren't subject to internment took advantage of the concentration of Japanese rival farmers in internment camps and often seized their farms. So it was a great boon to some, even though a great tragedy to the Japanese Americans. As I mentioned earlier, there would be an effort later to force the U.S. government to apologize for internment and seek redress for the victims of internment. And tellingly, that movement does not begin until the 1960s. And it begins spearheaded by not those who were subject directly to internment, usually, sometimes, but not usually. Instead, their children, who were coming of age in the 1960s. 1960s, you had social movements, civil rights. We'll talk all about that later in the class, because California is such an epicenter for the civil rights struggles of that period. So that context is key. It was a time of racial reckoning with African Americans, Native Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, demanding change amidst the civil rights struggles of the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. And so for the children of those who were subject to internment, they were part of that student movement, that countercultural movement, civil rights efforts. And they found this redress movement that was designed to seek compensation, and most importantly, redress for the internment of their parents and grandparents. And it's very revealing that it was the children, not the people who are subject to internment, who are most vocal and active in the redress movement. One, it was because it was the 60s, and it was a time where young people were asserting themselves, calling for an end to the war in Vietnam, active in civil rights, feminism, gay rights, the key social movements of that period. But also, the people who were subject to internment, the true victims of it, were reticent to be critical of the U.S. government. And that makes sense. It makes sense that those who were subject to internment would be reticent to come out into the streets and demand redress. They had experienced being labeled un-American. They had experienced being seen as suspect. That's why they were subject to Executive Order 9066. They were seen as disloyal, unpatriotic, un-American. And so they were less inclined, though they were the true victims of internment, to lead this redress movement. Instead, it was their sons and daughters who sought that effort. And in 1976, there was a key development in that movement when, for the first time in American history, a U.S. president declared what had happened in this country, in California most prominently, the internment of Japanese Americans, as wrong. Now, we look back on that as a rather banal and obvious statement. But in 1976, that was a landmark achievement, because now we had the President of the United States, Gerald Ford, on record as admitting that internment was wrong. So, though to us it doesn't seem like such a great leap forward, of course it was wrong. Of course it was unconstitutional. But to get the President of the United States forward on record as saying such was an achievement. Many in 1976 still supported internment. Many history textbooks offered representations of it as justified. Many veterans of World War II had harbored and developed anti-Japanese sentiments that clouded the way in which they saw this event. So, though to our eyes saying that it's wrong seems to be so empty and banal, that was a key development in now forcing the federal government to acknowledge the crime of internment. And then in 1988, U.S. Congress passes and President Reagan signs into law legislation that, one, offers an official apology from the federal government regarding Executive Order 9066, the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, and offers to those who were still alive, surviving internees, $20,000. Okay, not a lot of money, right? $20,000 for losing 3 years of your life, for experiencing the indignities, humiliations of internment, from bearing that for the rest of your life 40 years later, for losing your home, your farm, your business, your education. But as seemingly limited and unsatisfying as this development is, it was at least the federal government acknowledging the wrongness of internment and offering some compensation. Today in America, there's a great debate about reparations for slavery, for Jim Crow, for the 100 years of apartheid that followed the end of slavery, for African Americans who are subject to racialized violence, discrimination, efforts to deny them wealth or strip wealth of them. And though the reparations debate has gained some currency recently, it seems still a quixotic possibility, unlikely to take place. And yet, 1988, thanks to the social movement that began in the 1960s, there was some final resolution that required the federal government to acknowledge the wrongness of internment and offer some redress to those who were still alive, even though most only received that $25 and train ticket home. So the story of internment is a good example of how during World War II, during a conflict that was couched in the language of freedom and democracy, that freedom and democracy was lost here at home, particularly here in California, as so many of our fellow Californians were subject to internment. Latinos also were seen as outsiders within during World War II, and there's a couple key examples of that, both of which are based here in Los Angeles. In the summer of 1942, during World War II, in Commerce, the city of Commerce, here locally, a 14-year-old Latino boy was found dead in the Sleepy Lagoon neighborhood of that section of Commerce, California. This 14-year-old boy was found dead, but was unclear as to why he had died. There was no evidence that he was murdered or that there was some sort of crime involved. He may have drowned. No witnesses to back up that. But what happens is it activates this anti-Latino sentiment in California in this period, one that, again, also is built on a foundation we documented in earlier lectures. Remember, in the 1930s, there's this mass deportation campaign against Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans. Hundreds of thousands are forcibly deported in the 1930s amidst the Great Depression, amidst the great anti-Mexican sentiment in that period. That's why you needed a Bracero program in 1942 to try to bring back people who had been forcibly deported. So we talked in an earlier lecture about the anti-Mexican sentiment alive here in California in the early 20th century that the Sleepy Lagoon affair and what we'll talk about in a moment, the Zoot riots, are based on. And so when this event occurs in a largely Latino neighborhood in Commerce, the police come in and they round up arbitrarily, without any evidence, hundreds of young Hispanic men, Latino men, Mexican American men, and 23 are ultimately charged with murder, even though it's not even clear if a murder has occurred. And 17 of them are found guilty of the murder of this 14-year-old boy. While incarcerated, while awaiting trial, they're beaten and attacked in jail. There's testimony at their trial that, of course, they're guilty because Mexicans are violent people. The term used in the transcript of the trial, it's a racial characteristic, so they must be guilty. The problem, of course, for the prosecution was there's no evidence. How do you prove, one, a crime occurred and that these 23 men are culpable of this crime? Well, the evidence wasn't there, so they had to make up evidence based on confirming racial biases and prejudices within the jury. Eventually, their convictions are overturned because there's nothing there. They're not guilty. There's no crime even. And in the appellate court that overturned the conviction of those 17 men, the judge who presided over that overturning said that the whole trial was a fraud. The whole trial was based on, again, not evidence, not justice for the victim, but simply the anti-Mexican bias held by the judge involved in the trial, the police who gave testimony, the prosecuting attorney, and the jury. When the convictions are overturned, the overturning of that conviction and the initial conviction itself are all rationalized by this idea that, well, it was a communist plot. The communists were behind all of this. All right, we've talked earlier about the way in which Sinclair and Steinbeck are maligned as communist. I talked in those lectures about how after the Russian Revolution, when the Soviet Union emerges as the first communist nation on earth, there's this Red Scare in California and around the nation, this fear that there are communists everywhere. And so during World War II, there's this long-standing, extant anti-communist sentiment, and a lot of the controversies that came out of World War II were often blamed on communists as rabble-rousers and troublemakers, making the American justice system here look bad through the fraudulent and racist conviction of these 17 young men. The other key incident during World War II that represents the way in which Mexican Americans are subject to exclusionary efforts, violence, outsiders within, the Zoot riots. Zoot riots come out of a number of factors in World War II Los Angeles, World War II California. World War II was a period of booming economic times here in California, a wartime economy where people could find jobs making bombs, bullets, and boots for the war effort, big plants building battleships and submarines in Long Beach, in Downey, in Santa Monica. And young Chicano men, Mexican-American men, could find good-paying jobs. And so they had money in their pockets. Sometimes they dressed in public in big baggy Zoot suits. These were exaggerated suits with big baggy pants and a big overcoat that these young Chicano men likely inherited from their grandfathers when such suits were in style in the late 19th century. You couldn't buy these suits in World War II because cloth was rationed in World War II as part of the war effort because we needed cloth for bandages and uniforms. So these were old suits that were fashionable in the late 1800s. So you have these young Chicano men walking around in Zoot suits. They have money in their pockets. They were often too young to serve in the war effort. You had to be 21 to volunteer to fight in World War II, but they were old enough to walk around in public in Zoot suits and have money in their pockets. But the most transgressive thing that they did was daring to dance with white women in the dance halls of downtown LA. In Los Angeles, in World War II, there were dance halls. And we talked a little bit about dance halls earlier as a catalyst to the riots in Watsonville that targeted Filipino Americans. And in a dance hall, you pay a little money to dance with a dancer, a taxi dancer as they were called, and this offered a lot of companionship for young men, many of whom were serving in the war effort and were lonely and separated from their sweethearts, but also frequenting these dance halls were young Chicano men. And white sailors who were either shipping out from Los Angeles to go fight in the Pacific or coming back from a tour of duty saw these young brown men dancing with white women, and they could not accept that. Many of those who were involved in the Zoot riots were Southerners, white Southern sailors serving in the Navy who had never seen a Mexican American, and they objected to this scene in front of them of these brown young men putting their hands on the waists of white taxi dancers in downtown LA. In earlier lectures, a lot of threads coming together here, right, as we get deeper into the semester. In earlier lectures, we talked about anti-miscegenation laws, which were established in the Progressive Era, that forbid intermarriage between whites and a number of racial and religious minorities. There's this idea of keeping the races separate. That was a catalyst as well to Watsonville when a Filipino immigrant married a white woman, and you had that newspaper article, East is East and West is West, and never the twain shall meet. So we've already talked about how in previous lectures of all these fears and anxieties around race and sex, this fear of miscegenation, this fear of intermarriage or sex between whites and racial minorities. That's what led to anti-miscegenation laws. It led to the expansion of the California anti-miscegenation law in the 1930s to now include Filipinos as those ineligible to marry whites. One of the insights, and again, more about this as well later in the class and in the readings, one of the insights to take away from this class and other classes you may have on campus that deal with race is that race is often most intensely policed. Racism flares most intensely, often in regards to sex. It's telling that in American history, we ended Jim Crow segregation in 1964 with the Civil Rights Act of that year. We granted, finally, people of color the right to vote in 1965, but it's not until 1967, years after those developments, that we ended anti-miscegenation laws. So the last major civil rights breakthrough concerned the last taboo in many ways, sex between whites and non-whites. And so that's part of the story here of the Zoot riots, where on June 3rd, 1943, during the throes of World War II, mobs of white sailors attacked young Chicano men, and the riots begin, objecting to these young Chicano men dancing with white women. The LAPD, Los Angeles Police Department, is called to the scene to ostensibly end the riots, restore law and order, protect the victims of these riots. But instead of stopping the riots, they join with the rioters. And the LAPD begins to also beat and kill the Mexican Americans of downtown LA. A vengeance squad, a self-styled vengeance squad of LAPD officers now took this opportunity to exact in their mind revenge against these brown outsiders within. And so rather than quell the riots, the LAPD pours gasoline on the fire. Thousands of sailors and police officers participated in these riots. Hundreds of Californians were beaten, many of them killed, many arrested. The violence swelled, and now not only were Mexican Americans being targeted, but Filipino Americans in downtown LA were targeted and beaten. African Americans. Another one of the developments here in California during World War II is a large influx of African Americans in another spasm of the Great Migration, where African Americans are leaving the South, they're moving to northern cities like Chicago and New York, but they're also coming to Los Angeles. This will play a key role in a lot of the readings and lectures we'll have later in the class. The fact that during World War II, the African American population of Los Angeles doubles because they came here to serve in the war effort, to serve in the Navy and the Army, and also to work in the wartime economy. They too, African Americans, were targeted in the Zoot riots. So every brown and black person in downtown LA had to fear for their lives at the hands of ostensibly the institutions that were designed to protect them, the military and the police. But instead, the military and the police are beating and often killing brown and black people in downtown LA. So the riots went on for days. African Americans as well as Filipino Americans were also targeted. The Zoot riots taking place within World War II California, a conflict, World War II, that we were told was about freedom and democracy. When Zoot riots finally end, the local press, the LA Times and others, blame the victims of the Zoot riots. They represent the police and the sailors as heroes. They blame the violence on the Chicano men in their zoot suits. And so there's very little criticism or condemnation of the Zoot riots. The proof that now the blame was hoisted upon the victims is that in response to the Zoot riots, the LA City Council banned zoot suits. That's what started these riots. This is the problem. And so no longer can you have these young Chicano men walking around flamboyantly in their big, giant, flappy zoot suits. So it's not the LAPD who's disciplined or rebuked. It's, again, the victims. Eleanor Roosevelt was First Lady of the United States. During the periods we've been talking about over the last couple of lectures, the New Deal era, the response to the Great Depression, and now World War II. She's the wife of Franklin Roosevelt. And Eleanor Roosevelt's a remarkable woman, unlike any First Lady we've ever had in our history before or since, mostly in the sense that she was so political. She was so willing to give her opinion in a 1930s and 1940s America where First Ladies weren't expected to be opinionated, political, and women at large were not expected to be political. We're talking about a period where women had just recently secured the right to vote. But Eleanor Roosevelt said, I'm a citizen, I'm a voter, and I deserve, like everyone else, a chance to state my beliefs. And Eleanor Roosevelt, in the way in which she was a feminist, one who certainly asserted her political point of view, also had very enlightened views about race, far more than her husband, who was responsible for internment. It's Franklin Roosevelt who issues Executive Order 9066. Eleanor Roosevelt believed in racial equality. She fought for the African-American singer Marian Anderson, who she fought to have a chance to perform a national concert on the steps of Lincoln Memorial. Eleanor Roosevelt, as a result of her views about race and her commitment to stopping racism, criticized the LA Police Department and the perpetrators of the Zoot riots, and for that, she was called a communist, right? So again, evidence of how anything that makes America, California look bad must be due to the communists. And Eleanor Roosevelt, not exactly well regarded by the conservative LA Times of this period, was rebuked for daring to call out the racism that the Zoot riots exemplified. When the Zoot riots were investigated by the California State Senate, they too came to the conclusion that the real perpetrators of this incident were the commies who once again wanted to make America look bad during World War II and stoke the fires of racism and racial resentment, and then led to this riot that was seen as, again, demonstrative of the lack of democracy and freedom in California, in Los Angeles, in the United States at this time. It's hard to overstate the impact of World War II on California, in particular Southern California. This is the event that really moves the energy, attention, population of the state to the south, when San Francisco had previously been the largest city in California and had long been sort of the California city. Hollywood in Southern California helped to move some of the energy and population to the south, industries like oil, aviation, agribusiness. But the real event that makes Southern California the economic engine of California, up until more recent trends like Silicon Valley in the north, was World War II. World War II saw a huge influx of people, capital, to Los Angeles and Southern California. And so this was a time of prosperity, of economic growth, a big demographic boom with lots of people moving to Southern California. So one way of understanding World War II California is this time where the California dream seems to be alive after the ravages of what we talked about last week, the Great Depression. Now the economy was strong again. People were finding jobs in a wartime economy where everybody was needed on the factory floor. California was central to the war effort against Japan, as so many were trained here to ship off to the Pacific. Ships and submarines and so much of the munitions necessary in the war were produced in Santa Monica, in Long Beach. The war was couched in this language of freedom and democracy. We're fighting for freedoms that all human beings should be guaranteed. We are fighting against the greatest racist in human history. America is this beacon of freedom and opportunity. Now, take that story of World War II California and then put it in juxtaposition to the other story we've offered here in lecture of internment, of the Sleepy Lagoon trial, of the Zoot riots, all of which are also taking place during World War II California, that represent how Californians are actively denied that California dream rekindled by the wartime economy. How, though, despite the language of World War II as effort in the name of freedom and democracy, so many of our own citizens, our own Californians, are denied freedom and democracy, locked up in internment camps, beaten on the streets of downtown LA, incarcerated for a crime they did not commit, a crime that may not have even happened. So the controversies, dissonance, collisions between these two California stories in World War II. It's time of a booming economy, the ravages of the Great Depression behind us, a time where the nation's energy and attention is increasingly shifting to California amidst the wartime economy and its role in the war, amidst a conflict that's couched in this language of freedom and democracy for all. And then yet you have the other California stories we've enunciated here, which bring us back to where we started and that macro theme of the class. Who is a Californian? Who has a right to the California dream? So themes that we've encountered in lectures, that's certainly, again, the vibrant theme in the Arellano book you read earlier in the class. If you're a Japanese American, a Mexican American in California in World War II, are you seen as a Californian? It's a complicated story, complex story. It reminds us of how this question of who is a Californian, who has a right to the California dream, remains under contest.